So today, we're going to tie a classic. It's a dry fly. It's the Adams fly, which is a Mayfly. And there's a little bit of a story that goes with this. And I'll talk a little bit about that as I am working. I've got a size 14 dry in the vise, and I'm going to go ahead and use some 18-aught Semperfly Nano silk, just so that I have less buildup on this, because I have a tendency to get a lot of buildup on my flies. So we're going to go ahead and get our thread attached here, and we'll just swing in and cut this off with scissors. So try to make this as I'm going to take my time with this for a couple of reasons. The material came from a very, very special place. A few weeks ago, I had just a horrible day at work. I can't even remember, why it was horrible today, but it was one of those days where you get home from work, and I was tired. I was not happy. I was feeling a little bit down, and I pull into my driveway, and I'm organizing some of the stuff in my car, just getting ready to get out of my car, collecting my phone and stuff, and I look over, and there's somebody standing next to the window of my car on the driver's side. It kind of scared me there for a second, but then I recognized him as my neighbor from across the street, Paul. And he had a big smile on his face, and he had a bunch of boxes in his hand. And I got out of I didn't get out of the car, honestly. I opened the door, and my neighbor Paul said, this is my dad's fly tying material. He's 94. He can't tie flies any longer, and he said, I want you to have it, knowing that I tie flies. And there was just an enormous amount of materials that he provided to me. It wasn't the amount really that really hit me. What really hit me was knowing how passionate I am about tying flies, and what all of my material means to me, and knowing what it means to his dad, and his father as well as the kindness of a neighbor who recognized that there's somebody who could put this to use. I literally went from having a horrible day to I completely forgot anything that happened that day. Literally sat there in my car as tears were kind of welling up in my eyes, because I recognized what was being handed over to me. It was very special. It was very sacred. I've now gone through a lot of that material, and it's very clear that his dad is, I'm guessing he is an amazing fly tyer just based on looking at the materials that were provided, that he collected over the years. It sounds like he started collecting back in 1967, which was before I was even born, and does like to fish up in Island Park, Idaho, where we have a cabin, and I like to fish as well. But also the way that everything was so organized. It was very clear this is an individual who's meticulous and who ties flies. And so today, it's a classic. It's the Adams fly. I'm not going to do it perfectly because I always struggle a little bit with dry flies. But the kind of trick today is, other than the thread that I'm using today, all of the material I'm using on this fly comes from my neighbor across the street, Paul, and from his 94-year-old father. So this is completely dedicated to them, in appreciation to them for giving me such a wonderful, meaningful gift. So we will go ahead and proceed with the fly. So we do have our thread attached now. I'm going to keep my thread pretty waxed as we go through here. It just helps hold some things down. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to tie on the tails, and we're going to use a kind of a furnace hackle. And yeah, this is a furnace hackle that I got from my neighbor, from my neighbor's father, as well as a Grizzly Hackle, which also came from them. Even the hook and the vise came from Paul and through his dad. Tails, I've picked out from that hackle kind of a one from the back that's a little bit longer, and I am just going to strip off a few of these. So once I have those kind of in alignment like that, I'm going to remove them from the shaft of the feather, and I'm going to do that. I'm going to pinch the ends here pretty tight because I don't want to lose that alignment, and then I should be able to strip them right off of the feather. Then I'm going to go ahead and switch hands again, trying to hold that very tight as I do that. And I'm going to just take a measure where I want this tail. I want it to be about the length of the hook, maybe a little bit longer. I tend to do longer tails. And once I have that measurement, I know that's about the length of the hook. I'm going to go ahead and pinch here and move my fingers back, and then where I tie it in should be fairly close to the length that I'm looking for. So I'll just take a couple of wraps and I'll take a look at it and see how that's looking. And for me, I say that all the time, for me this looks just fine. It looks very sparse, and it is, but that's because we're also now going to turn to a longer piece off of that furnace, red orangish furnace hackle. So similar to the Grizzly Hackle, I'm going to get those tips lined up as well as I possibly can there by pulling them directly perpendicular 90 degrees from the shaft of the feather itself. When you do that, these tips line up much better. They don't have to be perfect, but once I have the alignment again, I'm going to pinch those tips really tight to make sure I keep those in place, and then I'm just going to strip those right off the feather again. And then I'm going to switch hands again. This time I'm not going to take a measurement because I already have some tails on here, so I just want this to be about the same length as the Grizzly Hackle that I put in place. And so I'm just going to take a few thread wraps here, secure that down, and now we're looking better, you know, a little bit bushier. So as I move down the hook, what I often do, just to be sure, is I'll grab hold of these tails back here, because I want to make sure and lift them up as a bunch, not pulling hard because I'll pull them right out, but that helps me maintain those fibers on the top of the hook shank, because that's what I want. I don't want them to spin around on me. At this point, I've got them down tight enough that I'm not too concerned about that. So I'm going to just continue to take some thread wraps back until I get to where the barb of the hook is here. Looks like maybe one more wrap here. Should do us pretty good. And then what I do, this is just optional, but I'm going to take one wrap underneath those fibers, and then I'm going to pull towards the eye of the hook while I take a couple of wraps. That keeps the tension, and that thread that went underneath is going to help keep those tails sticking straight up. What I do is I just do kind of a loose wrap and pull it tighter as I come around, and that just helps trap those remaining fibers. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to tie in a set of wings on this, and for the wings I am going to use a couple pieces of Grizzly. I've got two hackles here, two Grizzly Hackles. They're going to be sticking straight up like this as part of that wing. I really like the dark. You'll see there's a dark side. This is a dark side, and then there's more of a on the other side it's a little bit duller, and I want those dark sides pointing towards me, or pointing outwards from the hook. So I'm going to rearrange these two feathers to make sure that that's the way that they're setting, and then I'm going to work on getting them about the same, not about, I need them the same length. So I'm pretty good with that. So you can see I've got my two feathers. So here we are, we're ready to go. It's a little long, but that's okay. You're gonna want one feather on either side of the shank of the hook here. So I'm just gonna be fairly careful with that to make sure I've got that kind of an alignment. I'm going to take a kind of a loose wrap here. And then I'll pull that a little bit tighter. And this is where, again, you wanna just be careful, take your time. Now that I've got those on there, I can go ahead and you can see that they're not exactly where I want them to be, so I can actually just grab that whole bundle of feathers and just give it a slight turn to get those aligned better, just like so. So I'll just take a couple, looks at it, decide whether I'm okay with it or not. I'm okay with that. So I'm actually just going to take like one or two more thread wraps, and I'm going to pull these ones fairly tight now. I'm not as worried about pulling tight and have those wings spin under the hook after I've got those first couple of thread wraps in. So it does look like a little bit of a mess, but it won't for long. We'll come on in with our scissors, and we'll clip off the back ends of those to about where I want these to fold up. Okay, so now that I've got my thread there, I'm just going to push these up with my thumb and pull as much of this backwards as I can. And I'm trying to not have as many straggler fiber kind of things going on here. And we're basically going to build a little bit of a thread dam in front of these two feathers, and that's going to help those kind of stand up for us, just like so. So now we've got that's about right where I want them. I'm going to do a couple figure eights where I'm going to go right up through the center on one side and try to keep that from bending over completely, and then I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. I'm going to pull all of that back again and put in a couple more thread wraps, and by doing those figure eight wraps through the middle of these two wings here now, what that does is helps keep them separate, just like that. So here we are. I've cleaned up a tiny little bit. But you can see those two wings, they're kind of, doing the V away from one another. The figure eight going over across each will help keep them in place. My tails are still where they want to be. I am going to work a little bit on taper for half a second, because I really don't want a bulky body on this at all. So I only want the slightest of taper. And I've got another material to tie in, and so I want to make sure that I don't get this too bulky. The body is typically going to be more of a gray in color. I'm not going to use dubbing. I'm actually going to use thread for this, and I'm using kind of a white fluorescent. Just going to wrap it around my thread, just like that. Make sure I have that about as even as possible. Evenness doesn't matter in terms of how this looks. I just want to make sure I have enough material to do the body. And once I have that, just like that, around my thread, see, I can slide it up and down. I'm going to slide it down against the body, and then I'm going to just take some wraps with my thread, and that's going to lock this in place now. I'm going to let that carry over towards the lens side of the camera, because that's where I'm going to want to start my wraps. It just helps if you do it that way, not necessarily messing up the tails too much. From there, I'm going to again just work on taper a little bit. That material is ready to go. Just behind, you know, maybe a hook eye behind the wings that I have there. Then I'm just going to go ahead and take this white floss that we tied in, and I'm going to watch this really closely just to make sure that I get at least a couple of good wraps around the back end of the fly. And then I'm just going to take some kind of overlapping wraps as I move up. And I'm pulling this fairly tight. It's thread. I can actually crank on it. I don't want to break my hook, but I do want a nice tight body. It'll help keep this thing from sinking when you get out on the river. So I'm taking this, just again, overlapping wraps up the body of this fly. And I'll be tying over the top of some of this, so I'm okay, go ahead and taking this a little bit further up behind these two wings. And once I get it there, I'm going to take some turns over the top of that thread. So basically my thread is the white that I've tied in. I've got angled towards the eye of the hook, and my bobbin thread, black thread, is more towards the back of the hook, and it really only take a couple of turns to secure that. Give myself a tiny little bit of thread, and then I'm just going to take a few turns on this side just to make sure it's secure. From there I'm going to turn this upside down because that's where it kind of ended up, and I'm going to just come in here with the scissors and we'll snip that off. But you can see that it makes a really nice slick body there, and with a black underneath it ends up looking kind of like that gray color. So the last two materials we're going to tie on are going to be the hackles, and the Adams fly actually uses two hackles traditionally. One will be a grizzly and one will be a furnace. I'm tying on a 14 here, so I'll look over here for 14 on my gauge, and so I'm going to wrap my hackle around this post here, and I want the fibers to stick out to here, which at this gauge is telling me that's about the right size for a size 14 hook. Okay, so that's what you use hackle gauges for. Sometimes I'll go a little bit longer than, so if it's a 14, I may go up to a 12, or somewhere in between a 12 and a 14. So once I'm done there, I've already pre-selected one of the hackles out. So here's my Grizzly Hackle. And what I've done is I've stripped it so I have just stem here. And I've also stripped a few of the fibers on this top side. Not a lot, maybe 4 or 5 fibers is all. So you'll have to be really careful because you don't want to strip them off the other side. And once I have that, I want the side that I stripped a little bit further up the stem, I want that facing upwards. So I'm going to take this hackle here, and I'm going to I don't have to be fast here, take your time. I just want to make sure I get that positioned where I want it. I'll take a couple of thread wraps here. I'm actually going to take one behind it to just help secure it into place, just like so. And then I'm going to work my way up a little bit forward, being careful around these wings as much as I possibly can. We'll be manhandling those here in just a moment. But you'll be able to see as I turn my vise here, you can see the stem of that hackle sticking out. It's not too far, so it's not too much of a problem, but I am going to go ahead and trim some of that out, just like so, just so it's not sticking out over the eye of the hook. Then we're just going to take a wrap or two to secure that down back there. And then I'm going to come back, moving back towards where I started, where I tied that guy in. And from there I'm going to get my other hackle, which is going to be the fire or the kind of the red color hackle, and I've prepared this one already and selected the right size. Similar to the last one, I've got it stripped. You can see the stem here. You can maybe see even more clearly here where I have more fibers stripped from the top side of this than I do on the bottom side of this. But only, like, again, 4 or 5 fibers. Don't go to town on that. Once I have that positioned, I want the area that's stripped further up the hook. I want it on the top, just like we just did with our Grizzly Hackle. And I'm just going to take a loose thread wrap here. Make sure I get that about where I want it. I'll go ahead and take another wrap. I'll take one wrap behind the whole operation here, and my thread will slide up on me, which is kind of what I want it to do. And then I'm going to start working my way up the hook, just securing this the stem on this furnace hackle, or the reddish color hackle. So those are turns behind the wings. Now I'm going to go in front of the wings, pull my thread back a little bit just to make sure I'm securing that right up against the butt, or the bottom of those wings. You can see on this one I've got the stem sticking out over the eye. So I'm going to go ahead with my scissors and trim that out. So that it's not kind of getting in the way there. So now that I have my thread out of the way, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to grab my hackle pliers like this. And the way I do it anyway is I'm going to do one at a time. So I have 2 hackles that I need to wrap here. So I'm going to start out with the Grizzly Hackle. So I'm going to get that in my hackle pliers. I'm going to be very gentle with this because it will break. Again, this is one of those areas where you want to pull tight, but not so tight you break it off. Because I do want this to stand up, so you do need some tension on it. I'm going to want to take at least one full turn here at the back, and then I'm going to just slowly and carefully try not to overlap wraps as I move up the hook. So this next wrap should go right behind the wings here, and my next wrap after that needs to go right in front of those wings. So I'm just going to go ahead and just take my time and kind of let that slide on either side of those wings, and then I'm going to just take a couple more wraps here. About like that is going to be good for me. Now I've got to keep my tension on that hackle, not enough that it's going to break off, but I also don't want it to unwind. But we've got to get that hackle secure. So I've got my thread off of my bobbin cradle. I'm going to reel it in a little bit, and what I find is if you wiggle your thread as you're moving it through, and then I'm going to kind of pull that hackle more towards the eye of the hook as I do this. That helps trap fewer fibers, and I'm going to put in a couple of wraps behind here. Again, I'm kind of exaggerating by how far I'm pulling that hackle out there. Once I've got that, I'm going to go ahead and release that from my hackle pliers, just like that. And again, using that kind of wiggle method, I'm going to pull this balance back because I want to get some wraps on this side here. And once I have a few wraps on here like this, I'm actually going to take my fingers and I'm going to try to sweep as much of that back as I can. We can make it all look pretty towards the end. And if you just kind of take your time here a little bit, you'll be able to capture most of those fibers. So once I have that done, again, it looks a little messy and we'll clean it up. I'm going to throw in one more whip finish here. Actually, I'll use one more after that, but we're going to do a whip finish here again so I can use my bobbin cradle, but also to secure that hackle that we just tied in. I don't want too much bulk, so I'll just take a couple of wraps here, just like that. I'm gonna try to think ahead this time a little bit more, and I'm gonna throw some wax on my thread. That just helps us grab and hold down that hackle when we're trying to secure it against the shank of the hook. So I've got my thread waxed. I'm gonna bring up my bobbin cradle again, just like so, and grab my scissors. Getting ahead of myself a little bit. I do need to cut off the end of this grizzly hackle that looks a little bit like one of those wings. So make sure you're cutting the right thing. And I want to cut this off right at the very bottom. And I'm going to get my hackle pliers on the furnace piece here, and similar to the other, my wings are kind of angled backwards. I can move them around, so I'm going to go ahead and pull those forward a little bit so they're not interfering as much on these first wraps behind. So similar to the grizzly, we're going to want to take a couple of thread wraps just kind of behind those wings, keeping tension on it as much as you can. I'm going to actually sweep those wings back a little bit now and take a wrap or two now in front of those, more towards the eye of the hook here. And that's going to be good enough for me. So again, I'm keeping tension on that hackle with my hackle pliers. Not so much that I'm breaking it, but not so loose that I have it unwinding, because I do not want it to unwind. So now I'm going to do the wiggle thing again, and I'm going to kind of lean that hackle and my hackle pliers up a little bit forward towards the eye of the hook here. And I'll take a couple, 2 or 3 wraps that way with this kind of wiggling motion. And then I'm going to pull my hackle back towards the bend of the hook, and I'm going to try to get in a couple of wraps in front of it as well. So for now, that's going to do. I'm going to just release that furnace from my hackle pliers. And similar to what we did last time, I'm just going to take my fingers and I'm going to sweep as much of this material back as I possibly can. You're not going to get everything. There's always going to be some fibers that are going to be trapped a little bit. There are a couple of errant fibers, but that's okay. We'll get those fixed. From here, I'm going to go ahead and grab my whip finisher again, and we're going to go ahead and finish this one off with a 2 or 3 turn whip finish. Again, trying to be careful here that I'm not trapping any additional fibers any more than I already have. So I'll do that just about like that. I'll pull my whip finisher hook back towards the back end so it doesn't slide off the front end of the hook here. As I slowly pull this tighter and tighter, then I'm just going to pull that right off, just like so. We'll have a tiny little bit of cleanup to do. I'm going to reel some of my thread back in, just like so. So I can see where I want to cut that off. I'm going to cut that off right about there. The next thing is I need to cut the balance of this furnace hackle off, and again what I like to do is kind of pull it forward because that gives me good glimpse of where that shaft is, and I want this as tight against the thread as I possibly can get it. Okay, so hopefully that's showing up. This is the Adams, a very old traditional pattern, again tied with materials that came from my neighbor's father. That is such an amazing gift to me personally. my wings here, my Hackle wings, they look decent, but I probably would want them a little bit shorter. So they're a little bit long, but I'm not overly concerned about that. The thread made a really nice body, and then we used the same Hackle fibers for our tail here. So I hope you enjoyed it. This is a fly that you'll want to have in your box. Great Mayfly pattern called the Adams.